Mario Anderson. On today's program, we'll be chatting with the United States Congressman Andy Barr of Lexington. The Republican lawmaker has served in Washington, D.C. since January of 2013 as the representative for Kentucky's 6th congressional district, which includes 19 central Kentucky counties, including Fayette County. And since then, Congressman Barr has served on a variety of committees on Capitol Hill, including as a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee and ranking member of the National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy Committee. And Congressman Andy Barr joins us right now from Lexington. And Congressman, welcome back to In Focus, Kentucky.
Great to be back with you, Mario.
Absolutely. And Congressman, there's a lot of topics to get to today. So we'll first start, obviously, with the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. It first started back on February the 24th with the Russians invading. And we're midway through April now. What can you tell us from your perspective in Congress? What are you hearing? Are we any closer to this war actually being over?
I don't think so, Mario. And the Ukrainian people fighting for their freedom have inspired all of us. President Zelensky addressed a joint session of Congress by video technology after the invasion and was inspiring and asked for more assistance. Vladimir Putin is an authoritarian thug, a former KGB operative who has cracked down against not only his own people, but also the sovereign nation of Ukraine. This unprovoked, brutal aggression against the Ukrainian people is outrageous, and Vladimir Putin alone is responsible. But I want to emphasize that this didn't have to happen. A lack of deterrence was an invitation for this aggression, and what we saw was weakness inviting this aggression. The Biden administration could have done more in the run-up to the invasion. And now we see a response that is inadequate in my judgment.
I want to also ask you, too, there's obviously been lots of announcements about sanctions being imposed on Russia. But in your opinion, are they actually working? Are these sanctions having an impact on what's happening over with Russia and Vladimir Putin?
Well, sanctions policy is within the jurisdiction of my subcommittee, the National Security Subcommittee on the House Financial Services Committee. Is the committee that I lead for the Republicans. I work with my Democrat counterpart, Congressman Himes, who is the chairman of that subcommittee. We have oversight of the Treasury Department's implementation and enforcement of sanctions. Certainly, some of these sanctions that we've been putting into place in concert with our NATO allies and other allies around the world have had some effect. But Russia has responded with certain measures to prop up the ruble. And there are some gaping loopholes in these sanctions. So what have we done so far? The Treasury Department has imposed sanctions on Russian banks, on the Russian central bank. We have also imposed an embargo on the importation of Russian oil. Why is that important? Well, because of the domestic war on energy production by the Biden administration, we actually increased our dependence on imports of Russian oil. That was actually financing Putin's war machine. So it was a welcome change that this administration did impose that embargo, the ban on importation of about 600,000 barrels of Russian crude oil. But that's not enough, because in the sanctions against Russian banks, the Treasury Department put a general license in the sanctions for energy-related transactions. That means that all energy purchases by the Europeans and other countries, purchases of Russian oil and gas, can be processed by U.S. financial institutions. I introduced a bill to close that loophole. It's called the No Energy Revenue for Russian Hostilities Act. I pressed Treasury Secretary Yellen in a House Financial Services Committee hearing last week on this. I've had many conversations with the Deputy Treasury Secretary, Wally Adeyemo, about this. For the life of me, I don't understand why the Biden administration continues to showcase a weak position on Russia in the middle of this outrageous act of brutality and aggression, even as we hear intelligence reports of the Russians using chemical weapons, shelling innocent civilians, killing women and children as they try to escape, targeting civilian locations like movie theaters and train stations, preventing people from just escaping. This act of aggression should not stand, and we need to do more, not just in the way of providing military assistance, more weapon systems, Stinger missiles, javelins, aircraft to the Ukrainian resistance, but also tougher sanctions. The energy transactions that are continuing to flow are enabling Putin to access the hard currency, the foreign currency that he needs to finance this war. We need to stop that immediately.
And you mentioned your conversations with the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen as she appeared in a 3-hour plus hearing in front of the committee that you're a part of, and she appeared to respond somewhat positively to your proposal that you to create an escrow account for those proceeds from Russian oil and gas. And I think she said that it's worth exploring. So explain to us kind of the next steps of where we are on how that process works.
Well, I was encouraged that she had an open mind about my proposal. Look, I understand that the administration is concerned about our European allies' over-dependence on Russian energy. And so what I did in my legislation was to create both a stick and a carrot approach for Putin, an off-ramp for Putin, a diplomatic lever. And what I said was, to the extent our German friends and allies need those transactions to continue, allow the proceeds of the sales to go into an escrow account and then release those to Gazprom or to a Russian state-owned enterprise only when Putin withdraws from the Ukraine, only when the Russians retreat and restore the sovereign independence of Ukraine. When that happens, then the funds that have been escrowed from these transactions can be returned, but then only for humanitarian and peaceful purposes, not to finance Putin's war machine. Secretary Yellen was open to that approach, but they haven't taken action yet. That's why we will continue to press the Biden administration to take a tougher stand against Russia.
And we're talking with Congressman Andy Barr of Lexington, representing the 6th District. And we need to take our first break, but then we'll be right back with more of our conversation here on In Focus, Kentucky. Thanks for being with us on this week's edition of In Focus Kentucky. I'm Mario Anderson. In today's episode, we're discussing a variety of federal legislative topics and issues with U.S. Congressman Andy Barr of Lexington. And Congressman, as always, we appreciate your time today on the program.
Good to be with you.
I want to talk with you next about inflation. Obviously, a lot of things as it relates to that conversation. And a new report came out recently showing that U.S. inflation climbed to 8.5% in March, which is the highest rate since 1981. In your opinion, what are some of the factors contributing to this rise in prices for gas and food and other products for people across the country, but here in Kentucky as well?
Well, I've been in the district in Kentucky, central and eastern Kentucky, in the last several months, and this is really hurting everyday average Americans, certainly my constituents, who simply cannot afford the Biden administration's inflation tax. And make no mistake, this is Joe Biden's problem that he created. When Joe Biden took office, inflation was less than 2%. We had price stability, but a combination of factors of bad fiscal policy and, yes, bad monetary policy, and the Federal Reserve bears some of the blame here as well. But it was a toxic mix of constraining supply on the one hand, where you had a policy of ending U.S. energy dominance, a war against domestic energy production, increasing our dependence on foreign sources of energy, paying people to not work, so creating a labor shortage, all the while overspending, creating excess demand. So you had a supply shortage, excess demand that pushes prices up. That was the fiscal policy side of the inflation problem. On the monetary policy side, we have oversight. I have oversight as the top Republican on the subcommittee with jurisdiction over monetary policy. So we look at both fiscal policy and monetary policy. Monetary policy is the policy that happens at the Federal Reserve, the money supply. And as all of these fiscal policy mistakes were being made by the majority in the Congress, the Democrats overspending, President Biden's war on energy. All the while, the Federal Reserve refused to acknowledge that prices were going up. They called it transitory. They blamed the pandemic. President Biden blames the war in Ukraine and Putin. But the fact is, inflation was spiking well before the war in Ukraine and well after the pandemic started to abate. What was the difference? Why was U.S. inflation going sky high when the rest of the industrialized world was not experiencing this same level of inflation? The reason why the United States was unique in rising prices was, yes, because the Congress, against my objections, voted for $2 trillion in additional spending, 90% of which was totally unrelated to the pandemic, creating excess demand, constraining supply of labor, constraining supply of energy, threatening higher taxes, which meant that the supply chain issues were not resolving. Companies were not investing in dealing with the supply chain challenges because of the threat of higher taxes. And then the Federal Reserve was pushing billions of dollars of more quantitative easing, more money into the system, fanning the flames, adding fuel to the fire, and they called it transitory. Well, finally, in November of 2021, Fed Chairman Jay Powell acknowledged that he was wrong, that the Fed was wrong, and he retired the phrase transitory. He acknowledged that inflation was going to be with us, but then the Fed still didn't taper fast enough. And here we are in April, and we have the highest inflation in over 4 decades.
And what do you say to those Kentuckians in your district, but also just throughout the state that are concerned about, they're pinching their dollars and their pennies even tighter than normal? What relief is in sight, or do you see relief in sight anytime soon?
Well, help is on the way. And if Republicans regain the majority in the Congress, we will be able to accomplish several things. Number one, we're going to be able to stop the threat of higher taxes, which will encourage firms, businesses to invest in their supply chains. That will alleviate some of the supply shortage. We're going to conduct oversight over the Biden administration's war on energy. We're going to be promoting more domestic energy production to lower the price at the pump, decreasing our dependence on foreign sources of energy. We are going to also stop the spending spree, which is juicing the excess demand that we're seeing that's causing an increase in prices and making life unaffordable for middle-income Americans. And then we're going to be able to have the gavel. We're going to have better oversight over the Federal Reserve, and we're going to push the Fed to conduct monetary policy in a more conventional manner. Instead of continuing to flood our economy with excess money supply, we need a predictable monetary policies. We are the party. The Republican Party is the party of sound money, and we need to get back to stable prices.
And we need to take our final break, and then we'll continue with more of In Focus Kentucky and Congressman Andy Barr when we come right back. We appreciate you spending part of your day with us here on In Focus Kentucky, and we're chatting today with United States Representative Andy Barr of Lexington, and he's running for re-election this May for his 6th term in Congress. And Congressman Andy Barr, appreciate you being with us again on the program.
Great to be with you.
Congressman, I want to talk with you about another topic that is making news headlines across the country and people talking about it here in Kentucky. President Joe Biden recently announced that he's lifting of Title 42, which would restrict illegal migration at the border during the pandemic. Update our viewers on this piece of movement happening in Washington and your take on it.
Well, this decision to reverse the Title II policy, and Title 42 for your viewers is a restriction on immigration into the country during the pendency of a pandemic. The hypocrisy of the Biden administration is astounding. On the one hand, the CDC is now extending the mask mandate for Americans for airline travel. And so they're saying that the pandemic persists for the American people. But if you're an illegal immigrant, apparently the pandemic is over and they're lifting Title 42. Imagine the hypocrisy of saying, well, the pandemic shouldn't apply when it comes to restricting illegal immigration into this country. But for the American people, you still have to be subject to these draconian mandates, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, lockdowns. The American people are tired of this, and certainly let's at least be consistent.
And Congressman, I want to switch gears and talk with you about white oak trees. And some in Kentucky may not know that these trees are actually critical for industries like furniture, cabinetry, flooring, as well as wine, and also one of our signature industries, bourbon. Update our viewers on this white oak caucus that recently has been established that you are helping lead in Washington, D.C.
Well, Mario, as you know, I have the privilege of representing a great American industry, a great Kentucky industry, the bourbon distilling industry, and it is exploding. It's experiencing a renaissance. If you go to any of our distilleries in central Kentucky, you'll see the brand new visitor centers. We're experiencing a boom in bourbon tourism, and the opportunities for expanding the jobs and the economic opportunity and the exports to other parts of the world is really exciting. And so as we see the uptick in consumption and demand for this distinctively American spirit, we also see a need for more white oak. As you know, one of the criteria for making bourbon whiskey is it has to be aged in a brand new charred white oak barrel. That barrel and those staves come from white oak, mainly in North America. We're okay for the next 15 or 20 years in terms of the supply of that white oak, but we're going to run out, and we need to be sustainable with respect to white oak forests and reforestation of that important input into our signature industry. And so I, at the request of the bourbon industry here in Kentucky, I formed the White Oak Caucus. It's a great bipartisan caucus, and I've recruited as many Democrats to join this caucus as Republicans. And I think it's a great bipartisan issue. It's great for Kentucky because we need more white oak. I've encouraged many of my conservationist friends in the Republican Party, environmentalist friends in the Democrat Party to come together in a bipartisan way to promote reforestation. This is good for our environment. It's good for the bourbon industry, and it's good for jobs.
Well, Congressman Andy Barr, as always, we appreciate your time being with us on the program.
Great to be with you, Mario.
Absolutely, and that is all for this week's edition of In Focus Kentucky, and we appreciate you being along with us. If you missed any of today's program,